So in Screencast 5, I just want to explain to you briefly what we're going to be doing in the face-to-face sessions this week. I want to do this because by the time we've got into the room wiped and cleaned down, the fact that we only have 50 minutes in the room, but with cleaning either end, means we've only got 45 minutes, whereas under normal circumstances we'd have an hour. So I want to spend a bit of time just preparing you for what's going to come in this week's session. So I'm not going to talk much in this week's session. I'm certainly not going to stand at the front of the class and do a formal lecture. What we're going to do is an activity which is going to help you kind of just realise some of the things we've talked about over the first 2 weeks. And the first thing is that sport and the sport economy is diverse. And it's diverse in terms of the range of providers in the private, commercial, public, government and voluntary and third sector, and across different sports and in different countries. The importance and role of each of these sectors will vary. Okay. And it's also diverse in terms of the range of activity. So sports goods manufacturers, clothing, equipment, footwear, sports gambling, sport events, professional sports, broadcasting, etc., participation sports, health and fitness clubs. So the activity that I've got designed for this week is to try to help you get to grips with this. And in the session this week, and we will continue it into the face-to-face for next week, you will be choosing a sport of your choice, right? So you might want to think about the organisation you might like to do your assignment on for this organisation. So choose a sport which is relevant to the organisation that you want to look at for your assignment, right? And what you're going to be doing within that sport is identifying the scale and scope of the roles of the public, commercial and voluntary sectors, organisations in that sport at the different ends of the sport market, at the elite level and at the kind of community participation sport grassroots level. So in advance of the session, the face-to-face session this week, I'd like you to think about and choose a sport to focus on. When it comes to the face-to-face session, I'm going to ask you to draw out this grid, okay? And what we're going to actually do is we're going to look at, okay, this grid has different levels. It's got the international, the national and the local. If you like, we could kind of break this down into kind of our sports kind of model. The first one we looked at, we could call this up here elite sport, and we could call this down here kind of community sport, right? And then we're also going to look at the involvement of organisations in the commercial and private sector, the voluntary sector and the government and public sector organisations in each of these levels of sport. So I'm going to ask you, who are the commercial, sport and non-sport organisations who are involved in your sport at the international level? I'll ask you to name or map some of these organisations out in these squares here, right? I'll then say to you, at the international level, who do you think are the voluntary sector organisations who are involved? Okay. Now we might need a bit of a discussion about this, but we'll do this in the face-to-face session. And then I'll ask you, are there any government or public sector organisations at the international level who are involved? Okay, so I'll ask you so that the task really is to map out organisations at the international, and then I'll ask you the same set of questions at the national, and then I'll ask you the same set of questions for the local. Who are the commercial or private sector organisations who might be involved? Are there many involved at the local level? Who are the voluntary sector organisations involved at the local level? Who are the government and public sector organisations involved at this level? Now, the aim is by the end of the face-to-face session, you will have the landscape of organisations mapped out. You will, not every single organisation, but examples of some of who are the major organisations that are relevant to each individual square. You will have them mapped out, right? So you'll be looking at that, and I'm going to ask you to start to think about that, and you can maybe start to map them on when we get into the session. Between week 2 and week 3, what we'll ask you to start to do is kind of start to think about the links between some of these different organisations. So in our pyramidical hierarchy, we saw flows of money into and flows of money out. Well, within this, how are commercial sport organisations supporting or linked to voluntary sector sport organisations at the national level? What is the link between any, if there are any, you think, government or public sector organisations at the international level and voluntary sector organisations or commercial organisations? So we'll look at this. So I'll ask you to start to think about drawing links. And then after this, what I'll ask you to do is to begin to look at the flow of money within your area, your sport, within that particular economy. So I'm looking at contributions, financial, yeah. So what are the flows of expenditure within the economy from the commercial side, from the government side, within the voluntary sector? What is that? So what are the financial contributions? We've already talked about the value of volunteers. So how many volunteers are involved? Can you find any data sources? And I'll help you with that to start to be able to map out of that. And the idea is that for your sport and the organisation which you're going to look at within that sport, you'll start to map out and say, okay, who are the major players in the landscape? How do they relate to each other? And what are the flows of money in and around, and not just money, but resources, so volunteer, labour, and so on, within this sector of the sport economy. We'll explain more in the face-to-face session, but I wanted just to spend a few minutes to make you aware of what we're going to be working on this week in the face-to-face session, because it's not a lecture, it requires you to actually do some thinking and working. So that's the end of all the screencasts for this week. Thank you.